corpse god. Mynheer Hoffman, life in the Andean highlands has grown no easier in the 2 months since last I wrote, and I fear my writing to you is once again an exercise in caution. I know my initial letter played up the riches to be found on the Red Lake the locals are so wary of, but I've come to share their fears about the upland pool and its crimson depths. Strange things have happened there, some of which I've had the misfortune of witnessing myself, and I'm of the opinion that there are more than enough relics and gold along the Andes to waive the Red Lake as a lost cause, and redouble our efforts elsewhere. It must seem to you that half my dispatches of late are rife with caution, but I needn't remind you I don't surrender to fear easily. If it were bandits or cattle thieves hiding in the mountains, as it was in southern Peru, I'd rally a band of armed natives and wipe them out. But that is not the case with the Red Lake. Whatever haunts the area is so foul even the porters and laborers I import from up north have heard tell of its evil. Last week, I found a half-team of scouts I'd paid to encamp and test the waters of the lake missing under circumstances which are nothing short of astounding, and word of their loss has traveled quickly through Chile. A full exploration and extraction of the temple on the island at its heart would require a team from abroad to accomplish. That is why I'll take the time to describe the situation in full here, that you might better understand my trepidation. It started, as I've hinted in prior letters, with a rumor I picked up from natives in Lima. They spoke of a temple, long shadowed by curses and strange happenings, which apparently stood on a small island astride a weird lake in the Chilean highlands along the Andes. Rumors, especially those given under the hush of awe and nervous respect for the legendary they descend from, have given me my greatest finds scouring the ruins and lost sites of South America. The breathtaking copper image of the last Inca, which stands in your museum even now, was one off the back of just such a rumor of abandoned places and forgotten shadows. So I make certain to listen when I see the spark of truth in the eyes of the locals. They said this temple was to a god far older than their pagan sun god Inti, who had been cast down and imprisoned beneath the lake in days before even language had come to the Andean mountains. This old god had been speared during a duel with the Inti, or one of a dozen older names for the region's primordial sun god, and then fallen into the lake itself. The old god's fetid blood, they said, was responsible for the striking crimson color of the water there. Only eons later, when man had come into the hills, did the outcasts of society come to worship the thing whose corpse rested at the lake bottom. These wicked disciples cored out the stony island there for a temple, and raised a great and terrible stone statue of their dead deity. These corpse cults were, so legend says, responsible for many sacrificial abductions and murders in ancient days, and were wiped out on multiple occasions by the various kingdoms and empires that rose and fell among the South American Indians in those days. But always new believers would come trickling back up into the mountains, heeding some strange call or beacon only they seemed able to hear. The supernatural stories woven by men familiar with the region were bloody and cloaked in the mystique so common to native folklore. Apparently, the Red Lake was haunted, and the ghosts of those slain beneath the idol sang and spoke to their relatives in dreams, calling for them to climb the mountains and come down into the lake with them. The surrounding communities had lost many of their sons and daughters to drowning over the years, so it was said, for the youths would often sleepwalk in a blind stupor from their villages at night, only to be found floating lifeless in the lake days later. But there was a more exciting streak amongst these, about native treasure hunters seeking gold and copper trinkets to sell to the Spanish in the cities, and being drowned or lost in the course of their treks to the fabled island temple. These tales had all the trappings of moralistic folklore to them, of greed and gluttony punished by forces dark and, perhaps, divine. I didn't put any stock in them. Indeed, almost every site in which I've stricken treasure on this continent has been cloaked in similar stories, and in almost every case, they've proven little more than hollow noise. So, when my schedule allowed, I hired a guide from Chile's coast familiar with the area to map me a way up, scoffing at the countless others who'd warned me off after turning down my offer. The locals down here are even more skittish than the rubes in Peru to pass up such wealth in the name of tawdry tall tales, I kept telling myself. If only I'd been wise enough to heed their warnings, I'd have been halfway through a probably lucrative expedition elsewhere by now. I would certainly sleep better knowing less about that awful place. But like the gold hounds in all of those cautionary fairy tales I'd heard, I'd gotten a scent of money, and I wasn't about to pass it by. The team of 4 scouts I hired to clear the mapped path to the lake and strike a camp had to be gotten up in Lima and brought down across the border. They were mostly of Spanish extraction, and claimed to put little stock in legendary and spook tales. The second I received word they'd found it, ignoring the weighty warnings of the locals, of course, I followed their instructions and rode up into the mountains of northern Chile alone. That ride in was one of the most unpleasant I've ever had, worse than any mountaintop stranding or hostile village in the jungles. But there wasn't any inclement weather, nor were there violent natives to sour the journey. Rather, it was the deep and abiding strangeness of the land that embittered me. The highlands were arid, frigid in the grip of night, and whipped by salt winds beneath the scorching onslaught of day. The desert was often void of grass or scrub, a baked pan strewn with rocks carved by naught save wind and the 1 or 2 downpours the region sees through the year. But, despite the hard terrain, it was a wholesome place, a landscape of ivory and gold salt flats nestled in ridges that shame Europe's peaks. I rode mostly at night, and the skies were clearer than ever I'd seen them, a panoply of stars that would make jealous our finest astronomers and stargazers in the lowlands. It was dark when I came into the Valley of the Pillars, though, the native name for the vale where the lake rests, and I wish to God it had not been so. I crested a low hill and descended into a surreal, light mist, a haze which didn't eat up the newborn sun, but dulled it just enough to make my surroundings queer and amorphous in the dawn. There were trees here, a small forest of spindly, towering conifers that choked the hollow end to end. But the more I saw of them, the more aware I became that they were all centuries dead, desiccated and ossified like the ribs of some long-forgotten leviathan thrust up from the dry earth. Perhaps they were a holdover from a time when the land had not been so dry, sheltered by the sheer walls of the valley from the winds which whipped the Andes and left to mummify upright where they'd died. These were the pillars, then, their soaring height giving one the impression they had stumbled into the atrium of some grand and horrible old temple. Through these sentinels I could glimpse the glittering crimson of the lake itself, and before long I had wound through the growth following cloth markers left by the forward team and found myself upon the banks. It was not, however, a salt lake, like the much-discussed Red Lagoon not far off. Nor was it a sulfuric pool above some drowsy volcano, as is common elsewhere on Earth. No, the red lake was crystal clear despite its otherworldly hue, like some Nordic lake with a cool stone bottom, and water calm and cold as a mirror's face. It would have been inviting had it not been for the setting, the legends, and the awful noise that filled the valley. There was a drone in the air, a sort of hum that haunted the corpse woods. I marveled at it up until I witnessed the dense flocks of mosquitoes that quilted certain tracts of the water like blooms of algae or clumps of driftwood. These mosquitoes were large, as long as my hand on occasion, but seemed wholly content with the lake. They were not the bilious, itching parasites so common to the South American continent. Indeed, I was never troubled once by them during my time in the valley. But that obsession of theirs with the clear red water almost made the area more off-putting, for those bloated mosquitoes were the sole sign of life in the area. I skirted the shore and fast found the camp my predecessors had established for us on the rocky banks of the lake. My men were not so easy to find, though, and after deciding them gone from camp, I had to spend almost 2 hours riding the water's edge and calling out into the gloom of that misty cemetery of trees to find them. The whole time, I kept having to halt, to reassure myself I was not putting myself in danger by disturbing the mosquito song as it permeated the hollow. The mist ate my words, and they did not seem to hear me. When I did finally find some of the stolid Spaniards I had hired, it was only a single pair of them, and they were not in good condition. The two filled me in on all that had happened since coming to the site. Apparently they had been as unnerved as I, despite their materialism and supposed level-headedness. Their dreams had been strange, they said, of deep waterlogged holes and strange voices rumbling up from the lake bottom. They found their rest was fruitless, and they often awoke in strange positions, walking the shore of the droning red lake in reality, even as they swam it in dreams. They had heard voices in the mist. One man swore it came in tones of his deceased mother, calling him to swim in the water. As they'd gone through the process of testing the canoe they carried up for a crossing to the rumored island temple once I arrived, they became more and more certain they were being watched and, almost subconsciously, conducted themselves accordingly. Even then, speaking to me of things I could hardly discount in the vile half-light of that cursed valley, they whispered and glanced furtively about them, especially towards the water, and the small rocky outcrop upon it. On the 4th morning, the day before my arrival, they'd come from sleep to find one of their number missing. A full day's search had found him floating face down in the lake some 10 meters from shore, apparently drowned in some sleepwalking jaunt in the water. Hauling him in, the 3 survivors had buried him beneath a rocky cairn near camp. Debating whether to break camp and leave, the night had crept up on them, and they'd stayed up nearly till morning keeping watch. One professed he'd fallen asleep near daybreak, and another claimed he'd never drifted off at all. But, whatever the truth, the dawn revealed they were missing a 2nd man. Now, the 4 had become 2, and though those 2 survivors had searched through the morning, they had found no trace of the missing scout. This I drank in with a growing dread, for the more they spoke, the heavier our surreal surroundings weighed on me. Though I dismiss it now, so far removed from that awful red lake and its nightmarish chorus of overgrown mosquitoes, I could not help but pick up words in the drone as we spoke, words in a voice which sounded familiar, but whose meaning and identity I could not place. There was evil in the air there, and had I had my cowardly way, we all would have left then and there. But there was still a man missing, and though the idea mortified the pair, I convinced them at length that we'd better take out the canoe and see if our lost comrade had sleep-swum out to the rocky island not far from shore. Terrible as the place was, I'd been so disgusted by the environment riding in alone that I could not bear the thought of abandoning another to try and leave it alone, and in the end, the others felt the same. There were leeches in the water, they said, the size of swollen ocean lamprey, but as disinterested in men as were the mosquitoes on the water. That disinterest didn't make the sight of them flitting along the lake bottom any less disturbing as we rowed out onto the lake and made for the island not far from shore. Even that short jaunt in the boat made me feel hunted, especially when the bottom fell away, and the red water became impenetrably deep as the lake opened up before us. All that short paddle across the open expanse, I felt watched from below. Much as some morbid part of me wanted to look down into the depths where the light died away, I could not bring myself to do so after a while. That left it all up to my imagination, which painted gaping mouths and strange serpents in the deeps, watching us pass with the half-interest of glutted leviathans, already fattened on the corpse of whatever forgotten, ancient god was said to lie in rot down there. We beached the canoe along the isle's stony shore as best we could, and I scuttled from the craft like a child who imagines crocodiles or sharks behind him in the tub. The others followed. The island itself was more an outcrop than a true island, perhaps 40 meters across, and peaked like a tiny mountain. It may well have been carved. The angles and joints in the stone were far different than those on the rocky shore, and the stone itself seemed darker and fouler than the stone of the surrounding region. But it was so time-worn that the impressions I took at first for glyphs or reliefs had been weathered away. A cluster of lonely, tiny trees, of the same kind as the ones on the shore I took them to be, clung to the isle near the peak. These few were the sole living plants in the valley, and boasted bark bleached almost white, with black needles drooping on wilted branches. Amidst these was thrust up a lumpy sort of totem of petrified wood, not unlike the ones found among the native tribes of North America, with fierce jaws and long needles marked out by ancient carvers upon its sides. Singularly simple, but yet unforgettably gruesome, even in its decayed state. I silently weighed the possibility of taking it with us on the canoe, one sole bit of profit from a wasted trip. But what we found in the mouth of the temple dismissed any of those notions right away. It was one of my scouts that found the entrance to the temple. It was a diamond-shaped stone doorway set flat against one of the slopes of the island, just large enough for a man to pass through and yawning black as an abyss. Its entry hall was smooth and slick, coated with a mucus or slime of some sort which I'd later come to suspect the source of. One of the men lit a lantern, and I leaned in from the aperture, not fully trusting the slick and steep tunnel as it dropped away from the sun, calling out for our missing man. No answer came, but as the lantern's weak light flickered upon the slick surfaces of the tunnel, and my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I saw something far down the way, something pale against the black stone. I cried out again, and again no answer returned. One of the scouts fixed a rope to one of the small trees, and I began a half-hearted descent into the tunnel tied off at the waist. I thought the bright spot in the darkness looked to be flesh, perhaps the pallid flesh of the dead. Much as the place reeked of rot, and much as it radiated hopeless dread, I felt the need to confirm whether the shape in the depths was actually the missing man. Down I went, sliding and catching myself on the rope every few steps, eyes watering as the stench grew harsher. The lantern's glow threw wild beams off the slime slicks as I went, dazzling me even as I tried to remain calm and focused. All the while, the pale form below caught more and more of the reflected light, and gradually took shape. I was about 20 meters off when the thing became truly describable despite the dark. It was a blubbery mass, almost white, shot through with blue veins that seemed to throb in time with the swells and the mosquito drones from the surface. It seemed to be pressed up against another doorway, perhaps an opening to a larger chamber, and trinkets, jewelry, and glittering gems poured out from the seams whenever it twitched lazily in the shadow. I squinted, leaning down, trying to see without inching nearer. That's when it really moved, concertedly this time, without the spasms and shakes of unconscious sleep. It uncoiled like a great snake, large enough to fill the tunnel down which I crawled. But it was, I can tell you, no snake. I did not see it in full, for I fled the moment its mouth came into view. I do not know whether it had eyes, or exactly how long or large it was. I do not know if it was alone down there. But what I can tell you is that the beast had the toothy, ringed mouth of a great leech, and when it came to the face of the tunnel, words came out of that mouth, though it never opened or closed to form them once in the few seconds I watched it before my flight. At the risk of sounding like a madman, I'll tell you it sounded like my sister, dead some 4 years now. Her voice invited me to come down and join it in the temple. It told me the ceremony had just begun. It invited me to bring my friends. And it spoke to me all these words in my native Dutch. Had I not been so wholly consumed by the stench and the mosquito noise and that awful visage, I might have believed she was actually down there. But then, the thing began a slow and ponderous squeeze through the doorway, its fatty worm's body rippling and writhing with the effort. I scrambled away as instinct overtook my shock, and the scouts, having seen little but having heard everything, already had the boat prepared when I emerged breathless and screaming. We took to the water and fled, expecting pursuit, but none came. The only chase were the lilting words of my deceased sister, now singing a song in a language I did not understand. We didn't bother to break camp or drag along the canoe. We only carried food, and we made the 2-day trip back into town over the course of that night. None of us spoke of the ordeal, and we parted ways the moment we'd passed back north into Peru. I don't know how much of what I've related was a sort of nightmare hallucination brought on by the strangeness of that place. I don't know how much you've believed, either, but I don't really care. The purpose of this letter is merely to inform you that I won't be the one to go down into the temple on the Red Lake and dig up the treasures there. I've attached a map to the region, in case you wish to charter other relic hunters braver than I to delve into it for you, but I'd implore you to warn them to be armed, take caution, and be wary of sleeping near the lake. As I've told you before, there are things better left undisturbed. I'm now back in Lima and bound for the Peruvian interior. I've heard tell of some Incan cache on a farmer's plot there, or pre-Incan. As I've told you when you bother to correct me, I care little for the distinction, only the gold. I'll write as soon as I can if anything meaningful comes of the trip. Send me news of Amsterdam when next you write. Papers from home are impossible to come by down here. Signed, Sias Kruger, Lima, Peru, April 19th, 1897.